as a state, have one of the largest carbon footprints out of all the states in the U.S.
The last 3-4 years, you've seen more interest coming back because globally people are recognizing carbon management needs to be taken seriously.
We're just seeing just a long line of these experimentations with carbon capture and storage that just haven't worked.
So at a certain point, you kind of have to wonder, is it cheaper than, or whatever we're going to subsidize, should we be subsidizing renewable energy that we know works and the price has been dropping on, or should we be subsidizing carbon capture technology that hasn't been proven at scale and is also very costly and also makes it so that we continue to pull fossil fuels out of the ground and that we continue to burn fossil fuels.
Environmentalists argue that more focus needs to be put in technologies that they say are cheaper and more reliable.
I think the state of Louisiana really has not turned the corner yet on how much we need to be putting our effort and putting our investments behind renewable energies.
And while the state says that renewables is a key part of the plan, the actions of the state would suggest otherwise. Passing legislation that limits solar development and subsidizing oil and gas companies while making it hard for renewable energy markets to develop.
We have so much opportunity to do something different. 30 years ago, when scientists first started sounding the alarm about carbon in the atmosphere and how fossil fuels were contributing to that, we didn't have the opportunities of on and offshore wind, of solar. They weren't accessible, they weren't scalable, and now they are. They're actually the cheapest form of new energy.
Those opposed to the plan point beyond the cost and lack of proven ability and bring up the issue of attempting to store the carbon underground.
People who tout carbon capture will say things like that we have a lot of the infrastructure already in place, such as natural gas pipelines that we could reuse for carbon. That doesn't exactly work though, because carbon requires more pressure to pump the gas or turn it into a liquid and or pressurize it and put it through the pipeline. And if one of those pipelines bursts, that can cause a lot of problems like it did in Mississippi pretty recently. I think 40-something people went to a hospital because this carbon pipeline burst. So we can't actually use the same infrastructure.
The issues with storage go beyond faulty infrastructure and cost. In a report on CCS, the EPA states that the underground storage of carbon can lead to groundwater contamination, and sudden leaks or releases of carbon could be fatal.
They're going to pump carbon into underground caverns, and they're just saying it's going to stay there. We need to know, and we need experts to look at, make sure that it's going to stay there, and it's not going to get into water, and it's not going to get into our air, and ultimately, cause more carbon emissions.
When asked, though, the state believes that they've addressed those concerns.
Is what you put down there going to stay down there? Because that's pretty much our goal.
And do we know the answer to that yet, or are we still trying to figure that out?
No, we've got the rule set in place, and we're very confident that the work we've done, when we receive primacy, will be there. Because, like I say, in our case, in some parts of it, our rules are more strict than even the EPA's.
But for the residents who live above the proposed storage area, the state's confidence isn't reassuring.
It's not fair to have people to gamble with our health and our safety. And if they were in a situation where their families could not move and could not leave should something happen, how would they like it to have this ticking time bomb underneath them?
Joe Banner is a resident and activist living in Vacherie, an area that already deals with the effects of industry every day.
We are in Cancer Alley. There's a lot of heavy industry around us, petrochemical, grain terminals, grain elevators, and this has had an overwhelming burden on our community.
The region along the Mississippi River, along with another corner in southwest Louisiana, have been proposed as the sites for carbon storage. And the risks to everyday people haven't gone unnoticed.
I'm very just nervous about pumping chemicals into the ground where there's so much water and there's nothing really to block that from going into our water. We already have issues with water, so the last thing I think the solution should be is putting a dangerous chemical into our waterways, into our ground. We are tired of dealing with other people's mess, and we're tired of having our own, politicians and representatives promote that.
I understand why it's easy to be swayed. So it's hard to imagine that we can actually have a different world or build a different world. I understand why that's difficult, and I understand in particular why Louisiana's political leaders feel like they don't have public support for that, but I actually think that they do.
And while both the state and environmentalists will continue to work toward the same goal of reducing the emissions,
So we are on the front lines of climate change in both ways, in that we have a lot at stake, and also in that we can make a huge difference here because we have such a large amount of industry that is carbon emitting. So we could make a big difference, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.
I'm very concerned. I'm very scared for Louisiana if we don't change the way we think and the way we do things right now.
the debate over carbon capture and the policies surrounding it will continue.
The policy decisions that Louisiana makes now about carbon capture and storage, about offshore wind and solar, and whether or not to invest in good jobs and real clean energy, those decisions affect every single person in this state.
In Lafayette, I'm Daniel Phillips, KATC TV3.